Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Taproot here for our a third official live stream of the day. And with us, we have, as usual, my cohort in crime, Mr. S. Marshall Wilson. And we have a special guest today, Mr. Pat McGeehan. And thank you guys for tuning in. I'm going to turn this over to Marshall, and I think he's going to give an introduction for Pat, and we'll go from there. Marshall?
Well, thanks, Todd. I'd like to introduce Pat and then also kind of introduce the topic for discussion today. But frankly, I'm going to kind of step out of the way and let Pat take over the discussion. So first of all, this is Delegate Pat McGeehan of the 1st District way up in the northern panhandle of West Virginia. He is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy. He's also a former Air Force intelligence officer. And in addition to that, is currently working on his PhD in philosophy at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh. So he's an extremely bright gentleman. He's also a capable critical thinker who, by the way, has held me accountable for some of my mistaken ideas in the past. And one of those specific ones, which has really changed the way that I view American history and governance, is the discussion that he and I had a few years back about the Federalist versus the Anti-Federalist. Of course, the Federalists were the gentlemen who were writing letters to the public, trying to convince their legislators to ratify the newly written U.S. Constitution. This is on the heels of determining that the Articles of Confederation, which had first bound the states, the newly formed states at the Revolution, together into one nation. And then, of course, they determined that actually wasn't working. They had Congress, they met to discuss how to improve the Articles of Confederation to make them more effective, and determined that in the Articles of Confederation, there was no methodology for amending the Articles of Confederation. So they determined that what they had to do was write a whole new document which bound together what in effect would be a whole new government composed of the same states and also of many of the same men, but that would function differently. And there was a huge argument nationally about this. It was great, a great discussion. A lot of profound principles of human liberty and of governance were discussed in this conversation, but it got pretty heated. And basically what we ended up with was the Federalist Papers on the side of ratifying the newly written Constitution, and the Anti-Federalist, which raised some serious issues with the constitutional form of government that was proposed. Having taken the oath at 17 years old to offer my life to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, and having spent 20 years doing that, and also having taken a similar oath when I became a delegate for 2 terms, I was adamant that the Constitution was the way to do things. And those of you who know me know that I still intend to reestablish constitutional governance both in the state of West Virginia and in the United States of America. Having said that, I do not believe that the Constitution, I no longer believe that the Constitution is actually a perfect form of governance. What it is, in my estimation now, having been sent down this path years ago by Delegate Pat McGeehan in a discussion that he and I had privately, is that it is a pragmatic attempt to uphold the principles upon which the nation was founded, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, and that government exists to secure those rights. And then, of course, what happened was they had this discussion about how to form a government that would actually meet those criteria. Now, having said all that, Pat, if you don't mind, I would like to mute my microphone and just sit here and listen to you talk. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's fine. That's a good frame up of the debate 200 some years ago. So it's good to be with you. Good to see you again, Marshall. Todd, seen you around the Capitol plenty of times, so good to be on here. But yeah, if you want to bring up the Anti-Federalists, I guess we should probably just describe who these guys were. The Anti-Federalists were a group of men who as you sort of mentioned there, largely objected to this movement to upend and replace the government established by the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation government carried us through, the entire Revolutionary War. And that was starting to be seen by some of the elite men from this founding generation as ineffective. So the Anti-Federalists objected to this sort of movement that the Articles were ineffective, and they objected to the movement to replace it with ultimately a new national government, which ultimately became that which was set up underneath the U.S. Constitution we have. So probably the most prominent Anti-Federalists were Patrick Henry and George Mason, but there were many more. Some attended the Philadelphia Convention. Henry was there, Mason was there, but others did not. They're not as well known as the Federalists. This is for probably several reasons. The Federalist Papers were a group of essays which were published to influence the public to support and ratify this new Constitution. And these essays, entitled The Federalists, now we call them the Federalist Papers, but when they originally came out, they were just the Federalists. They were published as a collection almost immediately after they were written. So it was a very well-organized, concerted effort on behalf of, their elite faction to ratify the results of the Philadelphia Convention during the summer of 1787. The Anti-Federalist position was really far less organized. Actually, the collection we have today of the what would be, I guess, the counterpart or the counter, I guess the Anti-Federalist Papers, I guess you could call them, is a collection you could buy that has all this different assortment of Anti-Federalists, loosely speaking. We have that today, but it wasn't even first assembled into some sort of published collection until I think sometime during like the mid 20th century. And I think this is for several reasons. For starters, like I said, these papers, which were served something like letters to the editor to influence public opinion, they weren't done in an organized manner. So unlike Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and then you had John Jay in there. Those are the three guys that authored what we know as the Federalist Papers. The record left behind by these Anti-Federalist Papers were written by several different men who were acting, either spontaneously or at least, not in coordination with one another. So they all wrote underneath different pseudonyms. The Federalists, they all wrote underneath one pseudonym, Publius. But the Anti-Federalists, they would write under pseudonyms from, I'm trying to remember. One of them was, I think, the farmer. There was another adjective in there. And then there was Cato. Then there was several other different pseudonyms for these Anti-Federalist guys writing these letters to the editor. I'm just using that word as a way to connote what they were doing. But they weren't doing it in coordination. They wrote underneath these pseudonyms. Till this day, actually, we don't even know who, with any degree of certainty anyway, who some of the authors behind some of these letters or essays actually were, who were considered the Anti-Federalists. The main objections, I would have to say, by the Anti-Federalists came down to what they tried to frame as anti-democratic principles inside the new proposed Constitution. For instance, Henry and Mason, they objected actually in the debate. And by the way, most of the debate, I think we know about pretty much from James Madison's record keeping. And it was done in secret in Philadelphia, by the way. I mean, it was behind closed doors. The men were sworn not to really talk or reveal about what was said in there, but we have a record that came out decades later. And, some of these, they objected. Henry and Mason objected to these, some of the mechanisms, the organizing mechanisms and procedures in the newly proposed Constitution. For instance, Henry insists that there wasn't adequate representation in a new federal Congress. He wanted more popular control, with an increase in the number of representatives, which would obviously benefit of Virginia at the time because of its just size and population. But there were some more serious concerns, I think, which were pressing at the time, and one of them was, two of them, which were two main ones, were the issues of standing armies and the issue of direct taxation. I think in reality, it's fairly obvious that the objections had probably little to do with the ideology of the Democratic ideology, and more to do with their concern that, quite simply, their home states would be diminished in status and rank. Patrick Henry, he would often insist in the debate he was an American first and then a Virginian, but it's quite evident that, despite the protests, he was at heart a Virginian first. So he worried about the diminishment of Virginia. And I don't think it's really a coincidence that nearly all the Anti-Federalists happen to be Southerners too. Southern men had a lot to lose. They were typically very wealthy landed sort of aristocrats. Notwithstanding, they had some really good points. I think their best legacy, I would say, was, they end up losing the debate, they lose the argument, but I think their best legacy that's still with us is really the part of the Constitution which I think most people today like about it. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on or how you think, if you consider yourself conservative or some sort of modern day liberal, and that would be the Bill of Rights. The Federalists did not want a Bill of Rights. Hamilton wrote a whole piece against the Bill of Rights in one of his essays in the Federalist Papers. Madison was also opposed to the Bill of Rights, but concessions were made. Ultimately, 10 amendments made it across the finish line and were ratified into the document. Madison's argument was something like the Bill of Rights was unnecessary and somewhat redundant because of, his insistence that if the power was not authorized by the document itself, the power already did not exist anyway. And so Madison thought that if you just added this Bill of Rights, which started to name off very particular things that the federal government could not touch, in a way, Madison believed this would somehow imply or presuppose that, unless it was explicitly listed as a prohibition, it could then somehow be inserted that there was like implied powers the federal government could use, in spite of not having that explicit positive authorization for them.
So what I hear here is that you're saying that, so we have the enumerated powers in the Constitution that are specifically given to the U.S. government, to the federal government. And then we have the 10th Amendment, which says any power which is not specifically listed in the enumerated powers, therefore specifically devolves to the states and to the people. And his concern was that if you had a Bill of Rights that said what the people's rights were, that would work in the opposite direction and actually say that these specific things the federal government could not interfere with, which meant that everything else was open to the federal government. Is that
right?
Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and it's almost right. He added that he got that 9th Amendment across, which which I consider like James Madison's amendment, the Ninth Amendment, which states that there are other, the rights of the people are many and undefined. And so I can't remember exactly how the Ninth Amendment is worded from my memory, but that was sort of James Madison, and it really, I don't think the Ninth Amendment's ever, to my knowledge, it's like the Third Amendment. I don't think it's ever been involved in a court case, but anyway, that was a concern, but the concessions were made, and in a sense, I think the Anti-Federalists were right with the Bill of Rights. I think they were probably right, maybe accidentally, but because we don't have the same constitution in our society anymore. I mean, the text is still the same, more or less, but it's not what truly governs the nation. We live in a post-constitutional era, or at the very least, we've been living in an era where there's a new set of principles really that govern. I wouldn't call them principles, but that kind of govern the majority of the country, what constitutes the society. So anyway, but you can at least point to, hey, I have that right. It's for people to be able to point to the Second Amendment, But yeah, I mean, we live in a different country, and I think one thing I think that really, I was thinking about this morning. One thing that constitutes our society, I think, as a constitution, an unwritten constitution, because societies we have a written constitution, but there's already unwritten constitutions that sort of form how a society operates, or what its core beliefs are. And I really think that if you look at today's politics, one of those features for the unwritten constitution that sort of defines some of the essence of our society is this anti-racist creed. So, I mean, if you're deemed a racist today, that's considered far worse than even murder in many respects. I mean, you can murder someone. I mean, how many murders happen throughout the major urban areas every week now? But if you're a racist, those aren't even reported on. If you're a racist, though, like, that's deemed the greatest sin. And you could see this on the news all the time. Murders, they may get reported, but what ruins someone is if they're, accused of being a racist. So in some ways, this is the new constitution now, really. You might claim your rights underneath the written constitution, but those powers pale in comparison to this unwritten constitution in our society. And this is a big change when you think about this compared to say the ancients. Like, if you read say Dante, you read his Divine Comedy, I'm sure, Marshall. There were certain crimes that he considered far worse than murder, namely lying, fraud, betrayal. Right? These crimes were the worst. These were the worst sins. These were the sins that placed you at the deepest centers of his inferno. The murderers, they were all along the outside rings of hell. But, lying is perfectly acceptable now, especially if you're lying to go after the racists, right? I mean, so Donald Trump is a racist. So any amount of lies can be told, because this is the greatest sin. Does it matter that Trump has these old, written, formal constitutional rights, innocent until proven guilty, free speech, etc.? No, you can assert that all day long, but he's supposedly committed the biggest breach against one of our modern society's constitutional tenets. In part, he stands accused of being a racist, amongst other things, xenophobe, because he wants to close the southern border, and just it goes on from there. So I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent now, but
No. I want to explore this a little bit. First of all, I was actually helping one of my kids out with homework the other day on a current events project, writing about the recent situation where a guy walked in the dollar store and shot 3 people. It was a white man who shot black people. Apparently, he had established himself as a racist in the community for some time beforehand. And literally, the article that was being used for the current events project stated that the real problem was that he was a racist. Now, I personally believe that the fact that he took away the lives of 3 human beings is far more important than his motive for doing it. I mean, if he did it because he'd had a bad day, if he did it because he wanted their money, he still murdered people, and that is the real issue. Now, the thing is, we can hold people accountable for their actions, and we should. That's why government exists, to secure the natural rights of each individual citizen. Now, of course, it doesn't do that by protecting each individual citizen from infringement, but rather by holding accountable those who infringe upon the rights of other citizens, right? So in other words, it's not the government's job to keep me from being murdered. It's the government's job to find my murderer and hold them accountable. At the point that I'm murdered, the fact that I'm murdered is what matters. The fact that a human being has been deprived of their opportunity to live is the real issue. In other words, they've been deprived of the opportunity to freely exercise their right to life. Now, the reason behind it is simply a component of the case. I don't think that's the real crime. You've kind of discussed that a little bit, that murder is not as great a crime as racism. Racism is the motive for the crime in that situation, that a racist kills someone for racist motives. But the crime is a human being has been deprived of his or her right to life. That's the crime. So I'd like to throw that in, and it's just something that actually happened here in my house the other day. We were discussing that current event and how to describe what was happening to her class. The other thing is that you're talking about written versus unwritten constitutions, and how our government no longer, if I understand you correctly, I don't want to put words in your mouth, our government no longer functions according to the written constitution, but actually functions according to an unwritten constitution. And if I look at it that way, then the unwritten constitution can much more easily be amended simply by changing public what's the word I'm looking for?
Yeah,
Public sentiment.
Or the public's orientation. That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, that goes back to the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century. Actually, the end of the 19th century. Woodrow Wilson, no relation, thank God, wrote and published a paper when he was a professor. And he, in it, the paper is called The Study of Administration. And in it, he specifically says that it is the duty of, well, first of all, he said we had outgrown constitutional governance. We no longer needed a constitution because the people were not able to understand the importance of certain issues or the complications of running a government, the complexity of running a government. So the people no longer needed to be in charge. But unfortunately, we did have a written, according to him, unfortunately, we did have a written constitution, which placed the people at the pinnacle of power and made the government their citizens, the government the servants of the citizens. He said, what we really need to do is turn that over, because we're the experts. We're smarter than the average bear. We're smarter than the average Bubba out there in the world. And we need to tell them what needs to happen. But because they currently actually are the ones in charge based on the system that we have right now, the way that we do that is by convincing them of what we already think, so that they then tell us that's what they want, so that we can then do what we've already decided to do. That was Woodrow Wilson, 1887, I believe he published the paper. And I think that if we study U.S. governance throughout the 20th century and up to today, we can see the outworking of that principle, that they are smarter than we are. They're the experts. And what they've actually done is shaped public sentiment, public understanding of the situation, so that they can then have us elect the people who will do what they already want them to do, and support the issues that they already want to be supported. Does that fit in with what you're saying?
Yes, this is the emergence of the rule by the elite managerial class, because Woodrow Wilson was an academic. I mean, before he became president, he was, I believe, president of Princeton University. And so you had, by the early 20th century, a new class of elites who no longer were based in, famously, I believe it was Adams who said this Constitution's really that we wrote out is only as good. It's only good for a moral and religious people. But by the turn of the 20th century, the elites were no longer reflected with this sort of tradition where I think we largely come from, this Christian tradition, really, but they were reflected with, a scientism, sort of bureaucratic expertise, sort of tradition.
Technocracy.
Yes, and so you had the Ivy League schools in combination with a new rising administrative state by the end of World War II. And then you had, of course, the media is sort of a three-pronged, as Curtis Yarvin put it, a new cathedral. So with the academics being at the top, and you see a lot of this. So, and that's one reason why you can see, I was always trying to figure out, well, how exactly is it we supposedly have this free market and free exchange of ideas, a marketplace of ideas? How exactly is it where we see this, what's the best way to put it, this wokeness, this woke capitalism, or woke movement, whatever you want to call it? How is it uniform and throughout all of these institutions, throughout the administrative state, throughout the media, throughout practically all of corporate America? And there is varying explanations that never made sense to me. But when you consider that the sort of management class of elites, that sort of reflect what you're getting at with Woodrow Wilson's comments there, when they all come from Yale, Harvard, Princeton, Brown, they're all basically trained in this new, the academics at the height of, in charge of the gender studies programs or whatever they are the new high priests, right? And so you have, this new creed, and then once they go out to their different positions, whether it's corporate America, the administrative state, in the federal government, or in the media. And when I talk about the media, I'm talking about like the New York Times, the Washington Post, all these prestigious institutions that organically grew up in the country in the last 100 years, 150 years. The positions are all interchangeable, really. And so if you think about it, who's the idiot at Bud Light who the marketing executive that proposes putting this transgender person on a Bud Light beer can, knowing that their customers are people from the Midwest like us who don't subscribe to this radical ideology that they learned somewhere along the way at Harvard or whatever.
Well, I think that it's because they think that they shape public opinion. They think it's their job to tell us what to believe.
Sure. But my point in saying this is the corporate American part is not really so interested. We had this idea that it's based still off of a profit motive. And some of the corporations are definitely involved in some of this radical ideology because there's money to be made off it with some of the population centers. But there's a deeper motive there because you have, that person who did that with Bud Light, even though Bud Light lost like, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, he or she, whoever did it, is going to land on their feet somewhere else, in some administrative state posting or some sort of nice marketing firm gig, because they demonstrated faithfulness to the creed, right? So all this new elite class, all these positions within corporate America, the administration, they're all interchangeable. So these people all essentially believe the same thing, and that's why you see it so uniform throughout all of our major institutions, regardless of if it's government or if it's in the private sector or the
I
media.
would say to that point, Marshall just posted an article a couple of days ago about Gordon Gee. So he was at Brown University before and had some really crazy financial records there. And then he comes to WVU after having, they thought that he was retired. And now he's put, I don't know what all is going on at WVU, but I understand that they're at like a $45 million deficit right now.
Mhm.
And I think that's just another
Well,
example.
that's okay. They can be at a $45 million deficit because, they're a government supported institution, which means, the legislature can just take that money out of your pocket and give it to the university. So that's okay.
Yeah, notice what when they proposed all of the cuts, WVU went through and just recently and announced they have this huge deficit, and they proposed the cuts to these different programs at the university. Some were in mathematics, hard sciences, engineering. Notice what program they did not cut, which is telling to the point I'm trying to make. They did not propose cutting the gender studies program because that's off limits. That's the religion, man. That's their I shouldn't even call it religion. It's ideology. I think the difference really between ideology and true religion is based on the transcendentals. But that's a conversation for another time.
Hey, let me jump in here real quick, Pat, because I think this is fascinating. Currently, I am reading a book by Thomas Sowell called "The Quest for Cosmic Justice," and in it, he makes the argument that government doesn't exist to establish cosmic justice, but rather procedural justice. In other words, it exists to secure your individual natural rights, which means that it's only authorized to take actions when your rights are infringed upon, to hold the person who infringes upon them accountable. Whereas cosmic justice is actually making everything right. And that's God's purview, right? That's not something that men can do. We don't know everything. We don't have all power. We're not everywhere all the time. And we're not perfectly just. We're corrupt. Some of us are trying really hard to do what's right, but the fact remains that we're broken. We're incapable of achieving perfect justice. So what he says is part of the problem with modern or postmodern American governments is they, instead of trying to achieve procedural justice, are trying to achieve cosmic justice. And you're talking about an ideology versus simply a method for doing the job of government. And I agree with you. And I think that we would agree on this from what I've heard you say. But basically the idea is they are trying to reach beyond what is reachable by humans and to establish what they perceive to be justice that, it has no basis in the actual information available to a human being.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with some of that. I would say that their ideology is totally reducible to pure power, and it's ultimately nominalism. The view that only there are no universals. It's just power, and that's where their ideology really heads towards. And so the braver disciples to this ideology, such as you just demonstrated that you wrecked Bud Light and lost them, I don't know, $50 billion or something like that. Well, that's the more status you're going to receive within this new elite ruling class that we have in this country. And so the greater your reward, the greater your status goes up. I understand what you're saying. I mean, I do think that there is a sort of Puritan, the Puritans in Cambridge, I think you can draw a straight line from Puritan Cambridge to progressive Harvard, for instance, because the Puritans had a belief of total depravity for the human condition, and to make someone pure, you would need total communal power, basically, in order to somehow achieve that, which they couldn't even achieve. So that's sort of where I can relate to what you're saying, I guess. But again,
Gotcha.
this comes from my Catholic background, which differs somewhat from probably
Yeah.
from where you are on that take.
Well, yeah, but the thing is, I don't disagree with you on that. Hey, we've got a
I
comment from Barbara Thomas.
have
Go
a
ahead.
different view on the purpose of government. I think the government's purpose is to promote the common good, and that's a longer discussion, but we can have it.
Okay. Barbara Thomas posted a comment here. Can you see it, Pat?
During Woodrow Wilson's term, 1913, the 16th and 17th Amendments were ratified, thus relinquishing the sovereign states financial control of the federal government and their representation in the federal government. Yeah,
I believe
also,
those are the amendments. I believe those are the amendments establishing the right of the
Income-
federal government to directly tax individual citizens, and also taking away the state's power to elect senators, U.S. senators, and instead giving that to the populace.
yeah. I mean, and also, I think the most grievous thing that Wilson did was pass the Federal Reserve Act during a lame duck session of Congress in Christmas time, I think, 1913, I believe. So, and that in my opinion, that proved out to be the worst thing, because you could stealthily get away with taxing the people through basically just debasing the money supply, and we're seeing that right now. With what's the new rich man north of Richmond, your dollar ain't shit. I mean, you can see it.
Right.
This is a product of the Fed. But yeah, that's correct. I think the 17th Amendment, though, is a little bit overstated, because that was pretty much already in practice. Direct representation of direct elections of U.S. senators. Not maybe. So, for instance, mid 1800s to the late 1800s, you already had in practice, I think almost every state had the party that took over the state legislature already had their nominees and had to vote for their party's pick. And so, like, you can see this in, for instance, the great debate between Lincoln and Douglas, the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, 2 years before the Civil War breaks out. They're going around to, I believe it was 7 different little towns in Illinois, holding these debates for U.S. Senate in front of the people, because they know that, if their party gets swept in, they've already got, signed pledges that they'll be the U.S. senator. So I think it's a little overstated. I think the 17th Amendment just formally basically adopted what was already the practice. A lot of these states actually passed laws that you had to vote for your party's nominee too. But anyway, I don't know. I'm just getting sidetracked. That's just some little commentary there on the 17th Amendment. But yeah, I mean, I think
And actually, your commentary is why we invited you on.
Okay. Well,
I'm serious. Dude, I could present historical facts all by myself. It's your perspective on them that led to your invitation to be here. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, but it's good. It's good. It's if the anti-federal, let's just throw out there, if the anti-federalists had carried the day. I think the interesting really thing, though, between the anti-federalist and federalist debate was really when you look into the Constitutional Convention some of the major objections from Patrick Henry, George Mason, was that, hey, we are now acting just as individuals, because now you're talking about upending and replacing the entire government, that we have these procedures laid out to change. So you're just trying to upend the whole government. We don't have authority anymore to do that. So now we're just sitting here as not delegates to this, but as unauthorized individuals. And that was one of the things they were trying to get across. But alas, it happened anyway. So for better or worse, I mean, personally, I do think we needed to, at the time, I think, given the traditions that were in place, there needed to be some sort of stronger authority to more effectively wield power, because of all the problems that were from external threats and internal threats to order. But that's just me. Who knows?
Hey,
the Anti-Federalists
I cannot-
it probably would have been. It probably would have. The union would have probably dissolved sooner.
Probably.
Where that's,
Yeah.
Better thing. I don't know.
Hey, I cannot tell you how grateful I am for your time, your insight, all that you've taught me over the past few years, the things that you've inspired me to go out and learn on my own. Thank you, sir, for being here. And hope we can get you back at some other time to discuss some other topics.
Sure, man. All right.
Thank you.
Let's just not get into theology.
I think we'd have a good time with that one too.
All right,
That's funny.
God bless.
Thanks,
Hey,
Matt.
for our friends out there listening, I think what Pat's talking about is he is a devout Catholic, and I am a back in the woods Southern Baptist. I think that we'd have a really interesting discussion and find out that we both serve the same God and try really hard to do what we think He wants us to do. So I appreciate you, sir. Take care.
All right, you
Hey,
take care. God bless you.
I'm going to ask both of you after I end the broadcast here, if you could just stay in the website for just a minute, because it's going to make sure that it syncs up all the audio and video.
Of course.
Thank you, guys.
Mhm.
And thank all of you out there for tuning in today, and stay tuned for some future episodes.
Thanks, guys.